Good day and welcome to the fourth episode of the 2022-23 season of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius. I hope you all had a good weekend. It was a sports bonanza for myself as my Dodgers beat the Cardinals both Saturday and Sunday and guaranteed home field advantage throughout the National League postseason. In football, both my UCLA Bruins and LA Rams had victories, and of course the U.S. President's Cup team swept to victory for the ninth consecutive time over the international squad, USA, USA, USA. Our discussion today occurs as we begin to wrap up summer and move into fall, thank God. That, of course, brings us to the beginning of October and the new session of the Supreme Court, or the judicial oligarchy, as I call the institution. On Sunday, the nation's capital will be holding the Red Mass, which is a tradition of the court going back in our country to 1939 and is intended to bless those on the court with wisdom and good judgment. I imagine God is going to be working overtime this coming term. Also, we are taping this show on the day that the United States launched a refrigerator-sized satellite into an asteroid to see if we could move it, 12 or 18 inches. And so it's almost like living the Apollo program all over again. And you got to love these people. They're getting paid to crash very expensive items into asteroids to save the future of the world. So today we are going to be dealing with a subject that is very much in the news, and that is slavery. We want to focus on the varying attitudes towards slavery in the Revolutionary and Constitutional period and how this peculiar institution impacted the design of the Constitution. I don't think we can have this conversation without touching upon the controversy in our national narrative over what, when, and how slavery should be taught in our public school system. So let's begin our conversation with the guru of the 18th century, Professor Tim Moore from the University of Wisconsin. Tim, I'd like to know, was the debate about slavery at Philadelphia just about, were the motivations overwhelmingly about the political and economic situation or political power, or was there at all a moral component to this key issue?
I kind of did like a one of those tally sheets over the weekend as I was thinking about this topic, and for the most part, you read these debates, Madison's notes of the Philadelphia Convention, and you read them, and it points just painful. Like, how can you be? The short answer is yes. It's overwhelmingly about power and representation. But so you read all of this, and we in Wisconsin are quite attuned to this problem of presentism right now. But still, you read this stuff, and it's hard. There's really only one day. And that they really talk about the issues of morality surrounding this. It's overwhelmingly, the answer is yes, it's about representation and power. There's only one day, and I think it's August 22nd.
Does that involve Gouverneur Morris?
Yes, it does. And there's a great, and Mason. The great irony is Mason has the most has a lot of words, that if I'm tallying up the number of words or objections based on some kind of moral principle. So Mason has some problems. He also wants to blame the British for foisting slavery upon the colonies. Pinckney, you read a Southerner, South Carolina. Hey, it's all over history. What's the big deal? But it seems like on one day when they were talking about the 1808 clause, it comes up. There's no, I don't think there's any moral discussion when they were talking about 3/5. They hardly even talked about fugitive slave clause at all at the convention, but any moral content about it was on that day, primarily on August 24.
Well, can I ask you, Tim, because my lovely wife and I had a conversation on this on Saturday. To what, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. How would you describe the anti-slavery element in America at the time? Is it just a significant minority? We're talking maybe 5-10% of the population, obviously, a population within a population, or because I know Franklin starts the anti-slavery movement in Philadelphia in what, 1780, I forget what it is.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how would you describe the anti-slavery movement? I mean, is slavery an overwhelmingly acceptable institution in the States United?
I would say yes. Even northern states are duplicitous on this. I mean, the greatest slave traders are in Rhode Island. But it's an overwhelmingly accepted, quote, fact. This is what it is. Now, if there are qualms, it's about how long will it persist. And that's why I think the discussion about the 1808 clause really bears this out, these moral. And at the convention, there's two interesting things about the convention. Franklin gets I think it's largely a memo. Hey, bring this up at the convention. And it's from the Abolitionist Society. And Franklin shops it around amongst some folks at the convention. They basically say, table it, man. So he does. Another interesting offhanded comment, and I forget who it was, that said, hey, if we don't do something about this was in the context of the 1808 clause. Well, we don't do something about this, the Quakers and the Methodists are going to raise holy hell in this country.
Well, so
your point, like how many, I mean, what percentages, I don't know but there are two denominations that are well known in their views about being opposed to slavery.
So religious affiliation did have an impact on this viewpoint, or again, obviously the Quakers.
Well, no one but they're like the redheaded stepchildren of religious groups in early America. No one likes the Quakers. They're just like, they're crazy people. No, yeah. So yes, they're overwhelmingly and very vocal too. But is there a critical mass? No, I would say not.
So yeah, I've always struggled with this notion. If we go like to Alito's viewpoint on originalism and assessing the Constitution from the viewpoint of those who were living at the time, that, to say that there is pretty much no anti-slavery sentimentality, there, to me, always felt wrong. But it seems to me maybe I've been wrong. That, now, is that for practical purposes that maybe people were opposed to it personally, but in a practical political scenario, they didn't voice their opinion? Is that at all
I think that's a pretty accurate description, David, because of the talking and the rumblings at the convention. Morris is probably, I agree with Tim, Gouverneur Morris is probably the most outspoken in terms of like just calling it what it is, this evil that it is. But you can see other people, like Tim mentioned, like shopping ideas around, but because of political expedience, that stuff's tabled because they know that if you got to compromise. I mean,
so speaking of that, Chris, and Tim's mentioned it, and I don't know if I, in my years, if I taught certain things kind of inaccurately, I don't know if that's too strong a word, but the slave trade clause of 1808. And I went back and I looked at some sources, and there were some, I had no idea if they were respectable scholars, but there were some that said that the slave trade clause of 1808, all right, or the 20-year period, there's going to be a lot, really was, the the carrot that was given to the northern states, or the generally and I'm going to call them anti-slavery, but opposed to certain elements of slavery in the Constitution. That was the bone that was thrown to them to guarantee that slavery would eventually end. All right. Is that an accurate understanding, or was there another explanation to the 1808 agreement?
Well, originally it was going to be 1800.
Yeah.
And then Pinckney comes in, as Tim already mentioned, and says, let's make it 1808.
Yep.
Madison follows up with the comment, and these are from his notes, that he thought 20 years is plenty of time for enough mischief, right? Then he uses that word in quoting himself, that international slave trade would allow for. And there's a school of thought among some historians that the 20-year ban, if you think about it, because that's the one spot in the Constitution, one of the spots in the Constitution that can't be touched by amendment, right? That's protected in Article 5. You can't mess with that, right? By amendment. They're just saying that, that one school of thought being that this was to set slavery on towards its path of destruction. But I would go with Amar on this, because Amar absolutely says no, because what will happen is mathematically states are not going to emancipate people to get, to move away from that fraction of 3/5, because Southern states did not encourage free men to stay within the state, because they wouldn't count in their voting total. And there's debate, at the convention about the language about free persons, all persons, that, who gets to count in the representation. I don't think it was a bone to the anti-slave people. I would disagree with that.
Was there a trade-off?
Yeah, Mason and Langdon thought it was, that this was, and I find that interesting. Langdon, New Hampshire, and Mason, Virginia. They both thought the 1808 bargain was the part of the Constitution that was anti-slavery, and it was going to, set it on its course to end slavery. So obviously it's hard to tell when you're sitting in Philadelphia how this is going to play out, but there's two very influential people that thought so at that time.
Well, I came across something, and I don't know again how accurate it is, that there was something, that had to be traded for that clause, and it had to do to some degree with commercial trade and the commerce clause. Is that my understanding? Is that accurate?
Well, yes. I'll start out, and then maybe Chris can finish up on this. But there was a huge, Southerners really were scared to death in the 1780s about some things that occurred regarding the Mississippi. And they felt like, because during the 80s, there was this idea that the United States was going to give up all commercial trade along Mississippi. Well, Southerners just went ballistic on this. So they were very sensitive at Philadelphia about any kind of talk about what would be required for commercial treaties or commerce or laws relating to commerce in general. Now, they wanted like a 2/3 or a 3/5 agreement on anything commercial, certainly treaties, which would essentially give the South a veto over any kind of international commercial treaties. So they're very sensitive about commerce. And the perceived, amongst some Southerners, the perceived notion that Northerners would really run roughshod over them if it was just a simple majority in Congress to pass commercial legislation. So they're very concerned about commerce, Southerners.
I would also throw in the idea that I think from what I remember reading, the concern is also taxing on imports. I think there's a problem with that too, the capitation, the head tax. So I think that falls in there. I don't know if there's a direct link to any bone that was thrown to folks. We'll give you the 20-year time period, but we get this.
Well, I would argue there's the prohibition against export taxes. I would argue that indirectly favors the South because slave-produced products cannot be taxed. So,
yes.
In an indirect way, that export, so to your point directly, David, Southerners are concerned about this commercial interests So the ban on exports, I think, indirectly benefits slave-produced products of the South.
And Chris, I just want to make sure I was clear about it. Are you saying that in 1787, 88, there were people who were already arguing that this 1808 clause would do nothing to diminish the numbers and this, the importance of slavery?
No, I think the thought process was that they figured after 20 years they would have to be able to get their populations up as well as their enslaved population up, because you're still operating under the 3/5 clause. So by increasing your populations, that's going to give you enough weight in Washington to maybe curtail things and actually put a damper on anything that may come down the pike after 20 years. So I'm not going to say that there's anybody at the convention right then saying, oh, well, we'll throw them this bone and we'll be okay. But I think that the idea was populations in the South will go up. Enslaved populations will go up after 20 years. By getting our populations up, that's going to give us greater voting power in Congress. Therefore, we should be able to head off any of this kind of talk. Whether it be
they did talk about white immigration actually making slavery irrelevant too. So there was some of that discussion at Philadelphia that what poor white immigration would actually come in and undo slavery. That arguably they wouldn't even need an 1808 clause if white immigration would continue on the rise.
Well, it's my understanding, Chris, that one of the byproducts of the closing down of the slave trade was the development of a kind of a breeding economy. Is that you had in essence certain physical types of male African slaves who were taken around to breed as we do with certain other animal populations there as a way to compensate for the loss in the trade. I'm going to go back to a scene into the John Adams series on HBO, and I know that's we're not going to get into how completely accurate it was, but where Jefferson and Franklin and Adams are sitting around and they're looking at the first draft. And Franklin is looking at the paragraph that Jefferson gets thrown out, condemning the slave trade and talking about ending it. And then Franklin looks at Jefferson Riley and he says, doesn't this mean that your property would be worth more if we did away with the international slave trade? And Jefferson, in his kind of spacey kind of way, is like, I hadn't really considered that. So the idea is, and of course the ban is signed in 1807, takes effect in 1808, signed by President Jefferson. And what you see is the people leading the cause for this in Congress were the people from Virginia, because as the South the South is expanding, right? And we're bringing in states like Louisiana and Alabama. So, and if we close off the international slave trade, guess what? Our enslaved people become that much more valuable, and we can actually market them in other Southern states. So I think that definitely plays into it. Well, Professor Williams,
there's one more thing I want to mention about Mason. It's a fantastic paragraph in again August. This is on August 22. Mason, a Virginian, he makes this eloquent argument. It's kind of a backhanded moral argument. I've traveled up north and places up north is cleaner and they have a more vibrant economy. They have arts and manufacturers. And the further south I go, the crappier the country looks. I mean, here's a Virginian at the convention making this quasi-moral argument. Not so much that slavery on the front end is wrong, but it leads to just really bad stuff. And I find that really fascinating coming from Mason. Back to your original question about, is there any moral component in this?
Yeah, I think I came across that and I was really surprised. And it's one of, 1,000 things that I didn't know about this period and its people, and the fact that Mason would be so outspoken surprised me. So, Professor Williams, we've been kind of immersed here in the 18th century here for a while, and
sorry, Mike. Sorry,
I want to step back for a moment, because we are in the midst of a national, if you want to call it, conversation. Don't know how civil it is, but conversation about discussing and teaching this subject. Obviously, the 1619 project coming from the New York Times, and then some criticism of that project has brought to the forefront from its school boards all around the country about how do we teach race and slavery, in the 21st century. And I know you've read some things, that might relate to this. So, given your own studies, how would you frame for students and teachers the role of slavery in the American narrative?
I'm not sure. I guess I would say that what I've been struck by the last few years, as the 1619 projects and other similar sort of stories are told of kind of what the three of you were just talking about, how little of some of these facts I just actually learned during my education, all the way from high school through law school through graduate school. So I think in some ways, I think slavery has had this narrative of the original sin in American development, but one that we should be proud to say that we put behind us, kind of thing, or to think about it in terms of like that we all should be proud of the fact that it's behind us. And I think that what's come out in the recent kind of scholarship is obviously that is definitely not the case. And when you were asking, even from Tim and Chris, about what moral arguments were being made during this founding period, my guess is that there were a lot of moral arguments being made by those who were enslaved or those who were freed, that maybe we just don't have the records for. Like we just don't maybe know a lot about that. So
and that weren't at the convention. I mean, that's the other thing too. I mean, when you go outside the formal structures, that's another set of questions, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I look at and I would encourage. There's some. I'm not a historian, so some of this I'm kind of taking it at what they are teaching me. But these essays in here are bringing up aspects of slavery and this sort of the consequences of slavery that I just had not thought about as a student of American history and American politics. So to the extent that it's a project like that is bringing out these issues for us to think about, I think is a net positive. Now, how it plays out at a school board meeting for a high school or middle school, to be honest, this is where I really feel like I'm in a bubble right here at the university, because there's been probably nothing but praise to bring this into the discourse with what we're doing here at USD. And I know that's very different than how it's playing out in the rest of America.
Well, you're then the perfect candidate, because professionally you live in that bubble, but you're a parent of two middle school sons, and I know that there are people in the heartland who might consider even San Diego, a liberal or a bastion of liberalism, but historically it's not. It's much more purple than a lot of parts of California there. So I'm just curious. When you read that project, did you feel guilty? Did you feel bad about yourself because of your heritage and stuff? And I am kind of joking about that, because that's at the centerpiece of a lot of these laws that are being passed. Is we don't want to teach things to kids that make them feel bad or make them feel guilt by association because of their race or whatever. But I'm wondering about your sons. What do you want them to be exposed to in like eighth grade history, and as they move on to high school? How do you think this issue should be treated?
Well, I kind of want them to be exposed to the kind of conversation we're having right now, just about the details, other than or to frame it as a compromise that had to be made, or to frame it as there was no other sort of even if it wasn't the minority, it wasn't like there weren't people at the time who realized that it was completely disingenuous for us to be writing what we're writing about ourselves in the Declaration of Independence and other places, and to continue to have slavery. So, what I've been, you all know this better than I do. What I've been shocked with is just how little history my boys are getting in their education right now. Right? It's like it's a sprint through a lot of this stuff, and they're getting now in eighth grade, and I guess they're not going to get it again now until they're, I guess, juniors is when they take their next, which I just didn't realize before I was in this period. So yeah, there's a lot of work that's going to be going on at home to talk about these issues, and not about the issue of slavery per se, or more about the consequences of that. And what you're getting at, Dave, like what do you do as a white male, to be kind of specific, in society that's talking about this, and how do you balance this notion of acknowledging what's happened, acknowledging how it's affected your role in the system or in the systems, without overly feeling personally guilty or ashamed? I think there's a balance there between walking with the acknowledgement that when I walk into a room as a white male, there's something to be said about the systems that were created that allow me a certain maybe level of status that's maybe invisible, but it's there. How can I continue to do my work and not be curtailed by a lot of guilt? And that's the process.
Well, I must be cold as ice because I've never felt one iota sense of guilt or shame when teaching about the subject, because it's a historical subject. Is there a legacy that lives on into the 21st century? Absolutely. And to me, how we handle that legacy, probably requires, some more introspection on my behalf. But teaching about race in American history, I never once felt an iota of guilt or shame, because, even though my father, I think about my childhood home, in our hallway, we got a big portrait of, I forget, great granddaddy Davis Richmond, who was a Confederate officer, but ended up spending time in a Union prisoner of war camp kind of thing. But that was in my household, a Confederate officer kind of thing. And I didn't connect with him in any way, but, so I don't know, Chris and Tim, you wanted to jump in. Chris?
Well,
I just wondered how South Africans post-apartheid, do whites do whites feel a sense of guilt for the apartheid system? I mean, is Truth and Reconciliation as contentious as, say, this discussion that the 1619 Project has generated? I just comparatively, are there anything that Americans could learn from South Africans as they're wrestling with race issues?
Yeah,
And,
unfortunately, I'm not sure if we can, because keep in mind, in South Africa, at the moment that apartheid ended was the moment that there was a change in power, and South Africans wouldn't refer to it as reparations, but there's been a process of redistribution of resources in New South Africa that I think for a lot of my white South African friends, it's not about the guilt as much as it's a question of how much has to be redirected. How much are we going to redistribute resources until we can say we've done enough? That's really the debate, which we never had that. We had that moment for maybe 4 or 5 years when half the country was being militarily occupied. But since then, there hasn't been anything like that, I don't think.
Chris?
Well, I was when getting ready for this evening's broadcast or show, doing some research, and actually I flashed back to last week's and what we were trying to delineate between supremacy of the Constitution and a higher law. And Gouverneur Morris, as Tim mentioned, Luther Martin, Mason a little bit, even Madison and Jefferson, some of the things they're saying, of course, I think those guys are talking out of two sides of their mouth because they're more worried about their financial stability. But there are allusions to this higher law that the institution of slavery is clearly in defiance of. And so for students that perhaps, looking back on that Unit 6 question that we grappled with in terms of supremacy and where we were trying to delineate, I think Mike got us off on that, which was excellent tangent. I think when you look at these debates at the beginning of the nation, or actually at the Constitutional Convention, I should say, moving forward, there are people that will say this flies in the face of what we fought for. Luther Martin is for one comes to mind, Gouverneur Morris, as we mentioned. So I think it's really important to take a look at because we are talking about humans. We're talking about humanity. And so there is there's an overwhelming hypocrisy of these guys, knowing full well that, we're just going to kick the can down the road and hopefully somebody else figures it out because we're not going to be able to get this ratified without compromising on this.
So I think it was Mason invoked the judgment of heaven kind of clause.
Yeah.
At the convention.
In fact, God, was it Mason? I think didn't Mason predict that at some time in the future, relatively, not 500 years, but that we were going to pay a price for this? Yeah. I think it's Professor Kaminsky in watching his conversation said that a great tragedy would occur in America because of the institution of slavery, and that came out of Mason's mouth there, which again, one of those things I thought very fascinating, and how insightful Mason ended up being. So Tim, the kids are asked to deal with specifically kind of the construction design of the powers of Congress and the clause in the Constitution, and obviously the key one is representation. When we get to slavery. What I'm curious about, and I've gone on this rant before, is I look at these these compromises, and I tend to believe that the so-called northern states punted, or the Federalists punted on so much. What did the southern states? What were their compromises in order to get the things they wanted in the Constitution?
Well, I would argue they back off on a high standard for commercial laws and treaties. I'd say that's a Southern concession of sorts. I'd also say that when you combine, you mix up the Electoral College and you put a dash of 1808 in there. I'd say that's the Southerners, if you think about this, we can get a bump in representation through the electoral 3/5 combined with electoral, but the 1808 is going to put a damper on that representation, potentially. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball there to know what kind of immigration will happen. So I think there aren't many, but I think when they look at how the mechanics of representation work and the 1808 clause and the Electoral College, I think they're holding their breath that it wouldn't come back to bite them. And I would also say, I think that, and this does come up at the convention a little bit, it was a belief by many people there that the North would benefit from the Senate. Because you look at the non-slave states, you add those up, there'd be more senators from the North than there would be senators from the South. And the House would actually benefit the South. I mean, they actually talked about that at the convention. So I think a lot of people don't think about that, or haven't thought geographically about the Senate. and how it does benefit the North initially on this slavery issue.
Do you find, Professor Moore, any of these compromises over the powers that are in some way, shape, or form associated with the institution of slavery, these clauses in the Constitution, do you find any of those offensive?
Yeah, I find the privilege and immunities clause bargain. I mean, think about that.
Help
It
me
was
out. Help me out.
privileges and immunities of citizens. That language is there, and I think that is a direct impact on the offensiveness meter, because privilege and immunities applies to citizens. Well, that would exclude slaves just by definition at a citizenship level, let alone a humanity level. I think the fact. I know there's such a thing as appropriate extradition, but a fugitive slave clause, holy cow. I would suggest, I don't know if any scholars have ever done this, to think about the substantive due process commitment within the fugitive slave clause, that this piece of property, this human defined as a piece of property, is so valuable that later on, no amount of due process can get in the way of my right to get that piece of property back. I mean, that's really offensive, the fugitive slave clause, I think.
Well, and it gets even more as we begin to develop in the 19th century, and of course the schism in the country begins to grow. The application of that clause, I read recently that close to 40% of Africans who were arrested or taken under the fugitive slave clause weren't slaves. That so there wasn't only a substantive problem with it, there was a procedural problem with it.
Right.
Because how does one not prove that they are not a slave? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think that's the impetus, and Chris can help me out here. That's the impetus by all the personal liberty laws that are enacted by northern states.
Yes.
You gotta show up with a lot of proof in our courts.
Well, and I think that, for the students, I would draw a line to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and look at the specific language there, because there's fugitive slave clause written within there, to the Constitution, right? And then to other fugitive slave clauses, and to the 13th Amendment. There's language that's common in all of those in terms of that process. So there's a similarity. And yeah, and in the northern states, you do have those laws in place to protect free African Americans. But I mean, for the students who are watching this, if you've not seen the film 12 Years a Slave, I would encourage you to watch it. It's a fantastic film, and it kind of encapsulates a lot of that kind of what you were talking about, David. As a free African American taken into bondage, actually kidnapped and put into slavery.
So I am curious, Professor Moore. Obviously, the institution of Congress is impacted significantly by the institution of slavery through a representation specifically, and as you say, the commercial laws that Congress can deal with, the fugitive slave clause, which I guess Congress is going to have to legislate, aren't they? Kind of how that's going to be carried out. And I am assuming as well that the institution of the executive branch or the presidency is going to be impacted by the institution of slavery.
Sure.
I am curious, and this is one of my, I'm the dumb kid in the back of the room. Is the judiciary, the institution of judiciary, in any way, shape, or form impacted by the slavery question in the design of the Constitution? I'm just wondering.
Yes.
Explain.
Well, because it creates, to use Akhil Amar's word, it creates a slaveocracy through the Electoral College. And then when you become president and you are a Southern president, you get to appoint to the judiciary who you want to appoint. People like, I don't know, Roger Taney. So you get to appoint people with, we go through the same process today, right? In terms of controlling the importance of controlling the executive branch, because then you can control the judiciary through the appointment process.
Well, but that's down the road. I'm going to push back a little bit. That's down the road, and you're right. It does perpetuate that, but I can't think of anything at the convention where they were thinking through in the design at the
right.
convention.
No, at the convention. I don't know that I don't know that it came up at the convention.
Yeah, I don't think there was, but I mean, you're right. I mean, nobody's got a crystal ball here. I mean, did Tommy free his slaves too? I mean, there's another great irony.
He did.
Yeah.
He did, which is kind of crazy. But I mean, I think there was a lot going on with Roger Taney. But he did free his slaves. But I think, they're not sitting there going, well, at the convention in 1787 going, 20 years from now, we'll have mostly Southern presidents, and we're going to fill the judiciary with mostly their appointments. And we know that when rulings come down the pike, they're going to be friendly to the institution. But that's
They still got to run it by a Northern dominated Senate, though. There's still more Northern states. I mean, until 1819, when balance becomes the key issue.
Right.
In Missouri.
Well, and that leads me to my next question, which, Tim, you kind of blew out of the water and with this information, because, and maybe I've only taken a 19th century perspective here and not that late 18th, early 19th century, because I've always understood that the design, and really, Chris, the question is to you, I came across a historian who argued that the creation of the Senate and the powers given to this branch were all about protecting the institution of slavery. Is this guy out in left field? And
I'd like to know what his argument is, David. I don't know who that is, but I don't know that that's the case. I'm going to go with Tim because he alluded to this, and I think it was Madison at the convention was actually tallying states, right? Yep. So because this whole issue of the the 3/5 clause that is going to cause so many problems,
which is going. Go ahead. Yeah,
it's really about representation. Even the quote from Madison in the root of the question, and the main question, I encourage students to read both sides of what Madison is saying there, because this is all about representation. And it is Madison that goes on to tally the number of northern states versus the number of southern states. And I'm backing up what Tim said earlier about the Senate actually is going to be, I'd say, dominated, but certainly the teeter-totters tipped in the balance of northern states there. So I'd like to see what this gentleman's argument is.
Well, and I'll have to, it's somewhere in my notes here. I mean, that may be true, and in their speculation of the original Constitution and those first 20 years, but it's also true that by the 1830s, he's absolutely right. It is the Senate that becomes the institutional, problem for this country as far as dealing with this problem. It is the Senate, which then leads, or the balance, I guess, Tim, that you're talking about.
It's naturally there's going to be the Senate, because you're going to see populations increase, especially through immigration in what we call the northern states, at a much greater rate than you see the southern states, right? You have an enslaved population that blows up in the South, because it's not like the institution in the Caribbean where yellow fever, malaria gets everybody, whether you're enslaved or not. So you get that population of enslaved people in the South that blows up. So you have a greater population coming in the North that by the time 1850 rolls around, you have a much greater population in the North than you do in the South.
I wonder whether it's more about the rules of the Senate rather than the Senate design itself.
And he does talk about that, and I did, and I know I wrote it somewhere. I was having a problem with it because he seemed to be focusing a little bit on design, but a lot on the internal workings of the Senate.
Sure.
And that's really not. I mean, it is constitutional because they get to make the rules.
Right.
All right. And the Senate, in his opinion, has overwhelmingly been dominated by Southern senators for most of our history. All right. Or, and again, in the 20th century, he points out that it was Midwestern senators, all right, that had a tremendous amount of power in the Senate, and they were more sympathetic to the Southern case when it came to race and things like that. So I'll have to look that up and maybe send it to you guys. But there's no doubt that the Electoral College determined again on equal representation in the Senate. There has a major impact in the antebellum period. Is that not correct?
Very much
I
so.
think that's right.
Yes.
I've never thought about how many Southerners do we have as presidents from Washington to Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln's not a Southerner, or Southern sympathizers, I guess, there. And I'm wondering, if the North is so dominant in population, why do we end up with so many Southern presidents?
3/5 compromise. Because if you look at during the founding era, if you look at the population of Pennsylvania, say compared to the population of South Carolina, Pennsylvania clearly dominates. But when South Carolina and eventually the other southern states are allowed to include their enslaved population, it really helps to balance out that scale a little bit. So I think the Electoral College, because for the students who will hopefully read through Madison's notes and read these debates, which Madison says, by the way, not to use for constitutional interpretation, but you can see the arguments being made at the convention about how we're going to elect the president. Should we just count all free people? Should we let all free citizens vote? There's a lot of debate about this. So I think the idea of coming up, and of course the Southerners are opposed to it because they know they'll be outvoted every time. So
we've only got 3 Northerners: Adams, Van Buren, Buchanan, I think, was Pennsylvania, but he was a Southern sympathizer. I don't know what Pierce was. Polk was Southern.
Yeah, and that's again, that's a curiosity there.
Yeah.
Given this idea that they thought that well, I don't know.
Fillmore. Sorry, Fillmore. He doesn't count though.
Well, could it just be that what happened with the party system? As we know, the Federalists kind of just disappear really quickly. So the Democratic Republican Party is a Southern-based party, and they're the first to really get organized, right? I think there's some catch-up going on with those in the North to find what is going to be their one party. They seem to be a little more split, maybe.
But I think
that's a good point.
I want the students watching this, and hopefully they're sophisticated enough to know that we talk about North-South. The quote from Madison alludes to this a couple different times in the convention. The split between states with, at the time of this, all 13 states had enslaved people, even though it was dying out in Massachusetts, the first state to get rid of it. But in terms of attitudes towards African Americans or Africans, because they weren't, the idea that we call them African Americans is really kind of a misnomer because they were not given any benefits, as Tim alluded to, in terms of being American. They're enslaved people that have been ripped from their homeland, and one of the worst atrocities in history. That the attitudes in the North, were not like, oh, slavery is bad, slavery is evil. There's a great deal of, trying to say this and try and be somewhat political about it, but the racism that existed in the United States was prevalent throughout the country.
So the last thing that kids are asked to think about and be ready to talk about, Professor Williams, is which issues were left unaddressed by the Philadelphia Convention are most relevant today. And I'm going to say I struggle with this because the first time I read it, we have a previous tradition of using the word unresolved issues, the unresolved issues. And then I read it closely and said unaddressed. And I'll be honest, I had a meltdown trying to think about what was unaddressed. And I'm curious because you're the smartest guy I know. here in California. And that is there a difference between the word unaddressed and unresolved?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is. I mean, unresolved kind of hints at, was it something that was considered and they just did not go all the way to kind of decide what to do with it, but it was considered. Unaddressed, it could be, why didn't they kind of figure out how we're going to deal with Facebook today? That was unaddressed, and that's obviously not a fair critique. So yeah, I think you're right. There's a difference.
Is it fair to say that let's just hypothetically, they make a list, all right, and they address certain items on the list, and yeah, they may not address them clearly, and we end up with a lot of what Sue Leeson called white spaces and ambiguity. But then there's a lot of things on the list that never got talked about. Is that the difference?
I guess it could be, yeah. But was never talked about where Madison heard it to take notes that we know about. I mean, there might have been a lot of things that were being chatted about in the pubs after hours that no one wrote down. We don't really know, right? We don't know.
Well, it seems to me it leaves the door open for kids to come up with a hell of a lot of creative things. They didn't address, the rules of a left turn light. I'm
waiting for a kid at the competition to quote Mike to say that they didn't address Facebook.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it leaves the door open for a lot of judges as well to sort of.
The only things I could, in trying to be serious in my own mind, which is difficult on most days, the only issues I could think about were possibly the nature of union and the right to secede. Does a state have a right to leave the union, as well as, I guess, the status of women? They didn't address those two items. I thought seriously about Native Americans, and so I'm, maybe you guys have better information. Did they address the status of Native Americans? They clearly, although I saw something from someone today said that slavery was an unaddressed issue. And I thought, no, they addressed slavery. They spent a lot of time on that, it seems to me, but about Native Americans. Can you think of any others out there, Mike, that are unaddressed? And do you agree with at least my list of the nature of the union / secession and women, and maybe Native Americans?
Yeah, even with that, I would use your terminology more unresolved than unaddressed. But I think that. But anyways, I'll let Tim and Chris come back to the record on those. The other two that came to mind kind of relates to sort of what's going to form as party politics, right? I think that there's definitely, I think, an understanding at the time of the convention that factions are appearing and factions are going to be a part of this new society. In a way, I just finished the book that Chris has been telling us all to read for a few months now, The First Principles. And this notion of, a lot of what the founders had in mind was like civic virtue was going to be the foundation of a democratic society. And I think it's pretty evident to most folks at that time at the convention that civic virtue is not going to carry the way. But then what to do with political parties is kind of left unresolved or unaddressed. And then related to that is, what's the relationship between a president and a vice president who might come from different parties and have to serve together, which they resolve with the 12th Amendment, right? I mean, that's where they kind of realize that's not working out the way we thought. So yeah, I would add those two to your list that I think is fair.
So is citizenship unaddressed, unresolved, or neither? That's to anybody.
Ooh, well, it's stated. I don't know that it's clear.
Well, that's is an ambiguous, unclear, topic. Is that fall into the unaddressed or unresolved category?
I'd say I got to put my presentism glasses on at that point. Well, that's definitely unresolved because they punted on that.
I think it's unresolved because I think they do address when they're talking about elections and they're talking about who gets to vote. I think there is a discussion about citizenship, but there's not a definition. And so, we're still going to leave that up to the states to let them figure that out. And I would think that Native Americans were addressed at the convention because you see them, they're the only ethnic group mentioned within the document. They get treated as, obviously they're supposed to be treated as a separate and sovereign, but we know that, that's only on paper and it doesn't happen. It clearly doesn't happen throughout our history. But I don't think that's left.
Right. It may not be addressed satisfactorily, but it was addressed.
Right. Absolutely was.
Yeah. And one of the first acts of the first Congress was a treaty with Native Americans. I think, David, as we were talking here, I wonder whether Jefferson's insistence on the Louisiana issue points out something that the convention didn't address. Can I take this piece? The Constitution doesn't talk about adding turf. That's unaddressed.
It talks about new states being admitted.
Right, new states, but like Louisiana Territory, that's not a state. So Jefferson, he has this big quandary about whether he can even purchase this. Is this legal? Is it constitutional? So that might be one of those things that was unaddressed that comes up very early in our history, the Louisiana Purchase.
Well, it's spending power, so it's Congress. Does the president have independence?
But the Congress isn't over negotiating with the French either.
Well, but okay. So you may be right. I don't know if it's unresolved or whatever, but ultimately.
Well, I'm not in California to be in that really smart group out in California.
Wait,
I just was thinking he thought it was a problem. That was a roaring silence in the Constitution about adding turf.
Well, I did not. Well, also, I think maybe to split the hair here is that do I have the power as executive to do this, or is this a congressional power? And this is a deal that's too good to pass up. Because they're looking like a half penny an acre or something like that. So. We're just gonna, you know what? I'm gonna buy it, and if they don't like it, well, then whatever. So, who has the power to purchase that? Is that something that would have to be a treaty?
All right, I'll retract my suggestion then.
So, I am curious about the issue of union and secession. There had to be, it seems to me, some sense that if we're gonna form a union, I know what Lincoln says 80 and so many years later about the union, and I know what the court says in Texas. Was it Texas versus U.S. or whatever that decision? Texas versus White in 1868 or whatever. But did they? What did they think about the notion of union? That is. Can someone
the article says it's perpetual. The Vermont is a real curveball in the early republic because they were afraid that Vermont was going to join Canada. Now that wasn't a secession movement, more so because Vermont's on the front end. Do we join the United States or do we join Canada? So there was some talk about some of the Western territories not seceding because they weren't states yet, but would they align themselves with the European powers? So it's floating in the air, and I think that's one of the reasons why the word perpetual in the articles is important. That may get to your question, that it may be assumed that it would be permanent.
Well, I what I would think of is I think of Madison's advice to my country. That was published posthumously. Was it the paper, the Gazette, or what was it?
30s, or when? I think it was 1836, maybe.
It was 35. I think it was published in 35. Okay. But it was because by 35 there's already all kinds of 1835 students. There's all kinds of stuff brewing. There's all Andrew Jackson's on the scene. It's all Calhoun's on the scene, and so Madison has this published. It talks about the perpetual nature of union.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing published written by Madison. So he's arguing, for the perpetuity of the Union.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'm just curious whether Article 4, Section 4, in terms of guaranteeing to states a Republican form of government and, acting against domestic violence. Well, I mean, we all know that comes out of the real sort of fear they had about rebellions happening.
Slave rebellions.
Yeah. And it applies to states. It's not going to apply to new territories. But I think that to me is a place where they try to kind of say, we're kind of in this, like Tim was saying, this is something that's going to be perpetual.
I'm sorry, but when you said that, Tim, I had to chuckle. What was the first rebellion the United States government had to deal with?
Well, could be whiskey.
Yeah, I just, I'm sorry. When we talk about the notion of systemic, racism, and you're saying, they were worried about slave rebellions, yet, the first handful of rebellions are all angry white dude rebellions. Is it not till Nat Turner's that we see a major, slave rebellion? I'm sorry, trying to be a little bit humorous here.
Well, there's also Toussaint Louverture, in Haiti, which is just
that's 1815, 18.
Well, it's earlier than that, because that's one of the reasons we were able to buy the Louisiana Purchase, because Napoleon didn't need it anymore.
That's right. Okay, I'm sorry. I got my dates mixed up. Anyway, I found a chuckle there. They're worried about slave rebellions. You're kind of, what about those whiskey guys out there? So let's go ahead and wrap this up with kind of a tradition we try to keep to time and time or over time here, and that is recommendations to students and teachers about how they might want to address this question. And any recommendations for them, Professor Williams?
Yeah, I think it would build off of kind of the dialogue we've just had in terms of, I don't know, as you're researching this question, to be open to sort of new arguments that you're reading, maybe new facts, and bringing those into your discussion in a way where you're not applying presentism, but you're also looking at this issue from maybe a new and a different way.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Ditto with what Mike said. And I think it's difficult, if you're getting into the nuts and bolts discussion, as the question does, from the convention. The 1780s were a different time in American history. Were there people there that understood the evils of slavery? Clearly. Even Madison says it in the August 25 debate, it's a mistake to admit in the Constitution that there's property in men. So my frustration with Madison and others, it's like they're looking into a crystal ball, but the problem in front of them was bringing the Union forward under the Constitution. And to do that, you have to compromise. It's very difficult today, if you look at our situations, to not be judgmental. I would save a lot of the judgment for the Reconstruction era and the failure of Reconstruction to deal with the problems that got the can being kicked down the road at the founding era. But understand that African slavery, you cannot tell the story of America without telling the story of African slavery. So I think it's important for people to understand that.
Professor Moore?
Yeah, I was looking at the first bullet point. There's this question about what provisions in the Constitution had an impact on the powers of Congress, and we talked. And I think most teams will do the big four: 3/5, 1808, fugitive slave, no amendments before 1808. But I think the better teams can articulate and understand. There's four other ones that probably won't get mentioned much. And we've mentioned a couple of them. When Congress has the authority to call out militia to suppress internal rebellions, That's code language for the power of Congress to help Southern slave owners. I think another one is I think I mentioned earlier the no export tax. That favors Southern slave products and Southern slave owner. The Electoral College, certainly that's an easy one. How that benefits Southern interests and how Congress functions. And lastly, I would say the requirement for amendments, 3/4. Wow, that in a sense gives the Southern states a veto over many amendments that would be proposed. So I think those four, I would call those maybe secondary. Don't lose sight of those, because I think the more you can go beyond the four major ones, I think the better teams will be able to see the not so direct provisions, but that do indirectly benefit the South. So that would be my recommendation.
Hey, can I share one other thing? I was just looking for it on my phone, so forgive me because I saved it. It's a quote from Amanda Gorman, who is the young woman at Biden's inauguration that did the poetry. Just an incredibly talented young woman.
Yeah.
And this was so strong, I saved it. Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And I think, dealing with this topic and dealing with it, especially the way it's supercharged now, I think that's a really powerful statement.
Well, and I have a quick question to you guys, and it's about the last bullet on Unaddressed there. Were they conscious that they were not addressing these things, or is this question really a presentism question?
Yes.
That is, you see it as a presentism question. Yep. It's asking them to look back and say, oh, these guys didn't address this.
Mike said this, I don't know, he said this on one of these episodes. They gathered, and this is a really profound statement. They gathered to solve a set of problems then. So for us to look back and say, well, you should have, those weren't issues that they were trying to solve. They were trying to solve some problems in the 1780s. So
you guys, Chris and Mike, you concur with that?
Yes. But knowing, I think there was
yes, but you always love that. Yes, but
well, I just don't want to say there was a knowledge at the time of the immorality of this institution.
Yeah, but again, slavery is not one of the slavery is addressed. I'm specifically looking at this notion of unaddressed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So again, that seems to be a purely presentism question, is to look back and say, oh, they should have done this.
Well, damn Facebook. Yeah, they should have thought about that.
Yeah, and they should have thought about the designated hitter too.
Mike's point about political parties might be the only one that I would suggest
that they knew about it. It was there, but they chose not to address it. And I remember I brought that up one time, Professor Moore, and you said, "What could they have done? I mean, how could they have addressed it?" And I'll leave that to the students and teachers on political parties. But I'll be honest, I wish I was judging at various level or at this level to see how teams are going to deal with that, because I have my hard times getting my hands around if it's unaddressed. Doesn't that seem to imply that it either wasn't on their radar, or they just didn't think it was that significant to address, other than Facebook and the designated hitter. So we're going to wrap up tonight's episode. We hope we've given you some tangible things to get your hands around, and some issues to think about there. And we will be looking forward to seeing you again in the next session. We're going to be dealing with a favorite subject of Professor Moore, and that is a First Amendment issue of freedom of the press and the media there, because he has to deal with that on a weekly basis in his job. So that's what will be our talk about, and I'm looking forward to Mr. Moore's definition of fake news. That's going to be entertaining. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.